we're going to talk about some of the new features you can expect. We're going to kind of highlight at a high level kind of what the major new functionality will be. We're going to focus on the breaking changes that you'll need to know about as you migrate from V1 to V2. And yeah, lastly, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the conformance as well. So, if you're interested in applying for V2 conformance, and I hope you would be if you have a service running through the mediation layer, then there's a few things you'll need to be aware of, a few changes compared to V1. So in terms of a couple of sort of highlights of coming from the mediation layer that you can look forward to in version 2. So these are both around the API catalog that describes that shows the list of services that are running through the mediation layer alongside the documentation for each. So the first bullet point there is we're changing from our current UI framework to Material. So the idea here is to move to a kind of a well-known and respected and actively developed UI framework with the community that's around that. So we're excited to be moving to Material, and that will manifest in a more sort of modern look and feel of the API catalog. And then that'll also give us a launch pad to introduce further user experience benefits throughout the year. So that's the first thing I wanted to point out. The second thing, also related to the API catalog, is around a password change facility. So when you open up the catalog, you're asked for your mainframe credentials. And historically, we haven't been able to detect if your password has changed or has expired, and so that led to a poor user experience. In the second half of last year, we introduced a new endpoint into the mediation layer that enables Zowe clients like the API catalog or Zowe Explorer, if they should choose to do so in the future, would enable these clients to actually handle a password change process. So that means that if you open up the API catalog, you enter your credentials, you would get back some messaging around the fact that your password has expired and needs changing, and you can actually process that change within the catalog without needing to go somewhere else to do it, to switch context. So that's something, together with the Material move that that's in progress right now, will be coming to a conclusion shortly. So we're excited about those two changes in terms of the impact on user experience. So now we're going to get into some breaking changes, and for this I'm going to hand over to Andrej.
Hello everyone, my name is Andrej Chmel. I'll talk a bit about breaking changes. It will be presented in V2. The first one, and this one is the biggest from the point of view of all the users of Zowe and API Mediation Layer. So as you can see, we are moving from the usage of 2 path patterns, and we'll keep only the new one. That means that the first parameter or thing appears right after hostname, and port will be the service ID, and the other one will not be supported anymore. Next item here is the change of the location where you can download all our artifacts. This is mainly for extenders or users that are packaging or somehow accessing API ML artifacts directly, not using Zowe packs. And so we are moving from Zowe API ML SDK, removing the SDK directory. So this is another change. The next one is related to the configuration. And there are some changes related to how the environment variables will look like from the point of view of the services that consumes the variables, and also from the user perspective. So there will be a bit different way how you can configure Zowe, and also how API Mediation Layer is resolving those environment variables, possibly not all of one that you are used to configure API Mediation Layer will have any effect anymore. And the last one, what we have on the list, is from what we know, not heavily used. It's that we'll remove the possibility to specify a different authentication scheme for different instances of single service. So it will remain that you can specify for per service authentication scheme, but not per instance in case of high availability setup of the service. And basically, that's it from my side, and I will get word back to Elliot. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. I might just pause there and just check if there's any questions at all around any of these breaking changes.
Hey, Elliot, it's Joe. I have a quick question. Where you're reversing the order of the API v1 and then the service ID to being service ID, is the same true for the URL protocol where you've got UI? So right now you can do UI/v1/Zlux to look to desktop?
Yes, it's the same for all.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
And also for WebSockets and so on.
And also for WS as well. All right, cool, thanks. Yeah. Cheers.
Okay, so let's move on. I'm going to talk a bit more about that first one, service ID, now within a conformance context. So let's move on to the next. So those are the breaking changes. I'm going to talk a bit about V2 conformance. So as Rose mentioned earlier, you will need to apply for V2 conformance, and so we have a set of conformance criteria for services running through the mediation layer. And so what I'm going to focus on here are two changes to the conformance criteria for version 2 that you need to be aware of. So this will both of these will require minor changes to your service configuration, and you'll see these are hopefully fairly straightforward, and in fact can even be done within a V1 context as well. So the first one here that I'm showing is the change in the path pattern for conformance services. So something that Andrea mentioned earlier on, and this refers to kind of item number 8 in the conformance criteria. So the position of the service ID that you use in the URL just needs to move to the first place in your path. So in version 1 of Zowe, we support both, first position and last position. But moving forward from version 2, it will need to be in that first place. So if we go to the next slide, I just have an illustration of what I mean here. Again, I think this is fairly straightforward, but just so you can see it visually here. So, I've just invented a product Starship. And so you can see here that the first URL that you can see there, the current one, shows the service ID as the last element in the URI. You can see bcm.starship. So BCM being the prefix that we ask all organizations to insert ahead of their products. So that can be defined by them. BCM is for a Broadcom product, but it could be whatever prefix you want to use for your particular organization. So that's the kind of that's the current where it's in that last position. And then if you move down to the second URL down there, you can see what we're asking folks to do from version 2. So you can see that as Rose is pointing out, the service ID there, bcm.starship, is in first position in the URL. Okay,
Elliot,
so that's
can I ask a question now?
Sure, go ahead.
Russ, sure. Is the use of the BCM in our case for Broadcom, is that required for V2 conformance, or was that something that was just advised as well?
Yeah, it is required. It is, yeah. We do.
And that's
we do need
new
to
with
use
V2.
That. Yeah,
Okay.
In the case of Broadcom, the prefix is different. We use the CA prefix in version 1, but yeah, from version 2 onwards, we do need to make sure that we use, as Broadcom, we use the BCM prefix, and other other vendors will have their
exactly
own
that format,
prefix.
BCM period, right? That's the format.
Yes, that's exactly it. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so let's move to the second change in conformance for version 2. So this is about the API ID. So this is linked to a great new feature in Zowe CLI that basically automates the creation of profiles, and it uses information about services in the mediation layer to do so. So it needs a particular field for this profile automated CLI client configuration to actually function. It needs a particular field in your service configuration to be set, and that's the API ID field. So what we're asking is that this field is correctly set by the particular service. You can in version 1, I believe, you can actually leave this field empty, but we're asking that this field is actually filled with the required data, so that you can actually leverage this automated client CLI configuration feature. So again, in terms of the effort here, this is pretty small. I mean, it's just, you can just make a manual update to the value, and this can even be done now as part of V1. This doesn't need to wait for V2. But if it's not part of your V2 configuration, then you won't be conformant. So if we go to the next slide, I think I sort of give you a few more details here about what's needed here. So the API ID parameter, it's a kind of a unique identifier for the type of API in the mediation layer. So whoever's creating the API, the actual service can define this ID. and then it needs to be kind of up to 64 characters, lowercase alphanumeric characters. So it's something that goes into the configuration properties of your service. So again, as the I hopefully fairly straightforward as the sort of creator of the service, this should be a fairly easy addition that you can make so that you're V2 conformant. And I think that just about wraps it up, Rose, from a mediation layer perspective.
Great. Thanks, Elliot. We'll keep the lines open for any questions, comments, discussions, anything at all for the mediation layer folks.
So I have another question. This is Dave again.
Yeah. I
know we've had, and Elliot, you've responded to some things for us. The idea of the basic authentication is using switching to JWT tokens instead of basic authentication. Is that something that's required for V2 conformance, or is that a best practice that's strongly recommended, I guess, in general, or something else?
Yeah, we do ask that your services leverages single sign-on SSO. So that does mean that you'll need to move beyond basic authentication.
Well, but is that a requirement for V2 conformance, or is it? Is,
yeah.
Okay, I guess I didn't see that as a. You didn't. Okay, that's. Are there other things like that then you just didn't cover? Because for us, that's a breaking change. Big time breaking change. So
okay.
In fact, it's not sure it's one that we can satisfy. So are there other things like that? Because we did, that wasn't listed in the two because the two you listed were pretty simple.
Well, the two that I talked about are, changes in the conformance criteria compared to before. There has been an SSO requirement in version 1. In some cases we've been happy to accept pass tickets, a pass ticket implementation, but generally speaking, we have been asking, if for SSO compliance, which in order to have an actual in order to achieve conformance, but even for V1, so that just continues into V2.
Hey, Elliot and David, I don't know if I can help it, but I think so for the southbound service that you're trying to onboard to the API mediation layer, it can. So the gold standard would be that it can accept a token and authenticate it itself, validate it, and use that as a credential carrier. But pass tickets will still work, will they, Elliot? Because that's quite a nice onboarding pattern.
Pass tickets will work, yeah.
So if you have something that already is taking the password and just flowing the passwords through, you can just turning that into a pass ticket shouldn't be too difficult. It's just a different SAF call, and then the API mediation layer provides a facade pattern in front of you that just basically translates that token into a pass ticket for you. It's a little bit trickier to configure Zowe on z/OS to do that, but it's possible. I don't know if that helps, David.
Yeah, we can take this offline. We have a deal breaker issue there that we're going to have to address, and I think in more detail. I don't want to take up too much time with this group, but
David,
so the view though was that was already in V1. It must have been a change in V1 because we're conformant. We got conformance a while ago, but it's not a change from your perspective from that. Okay.
Let's David, I'm happy to talk to you about that offline, and we can have a look at your current configuration and then just see what it'll take to make that V2 conformant. Okay, that's no problem. We can do that.
Yeah, good. Okay, thank you.
Hey, Elliot, I've one other quick question that maybe Madeline asked it in the chat as well. So I just want to get clarification. So I understand service ID service ID as part of the URL, the path, so that has to be unique, and the naming convention is following the kind of Java notation. So it's your company's URL sort of reversed. So IBM.com, you know that IBM can't be used by anybody else, you know, BMC can't be. So you have guaranteed kind of global namespace isolation. What is the API ID? Is that part of the URL, or is that something, does that have to be global namespace? What's it?
Yeah, so that it's part of your configuration YAML for the actual service. It's not part of the URL. Correct me if I'm wrong here, Andre. But I don't believe it is. It's just a configuration parameter that's a kind of a unique identifier for your service. So you would also need to use, you know, the company prefix as well. And you know, in some of the examples that I've seen, it's often just you know, your company prefix dot product name or product group name.
So presumably you could just use the service ID if you wanted to. Is it user visible? Is it a user visible description?
I hesitated to say that, so I'm gonna just ask Andre if we can actually could you actually just use the same as your service ID?
Yeah, you can. This is only for documentation. This will be visible in catalog, for example, but also if you request API doc, so it doesn't have any impact on the URL. It's only about documentation.
Could it be the same API ID for multiple services if you're running multiple instances of the service, but they're essentially the same? Could it be the same then, API ID?
It should be unique.
It has to be unique for every service ID.
Oh, I have a feeling I have a feeling you can use the same one. I think we'll have to get back to you on that one, David. But
you understand the use case though, where you might actually have different instances of the service that that essentially share the same documentation and you know, they're really clones of each other, but for various reasons they might be different, you know, just different instances of the service.
So good question. I have a feeling you can reuse it, but I'll just make a note and get back to you on that one.
Okay. Yeah, Elliot, one other quick sort of observation. If because CA is now part of Broadcom, if you're changing your prefix, your service ID, presumably everybody that's using the CLI, where they would have had direct connection, if they now want to go through the API mediation layer because they want to benefit from you know, base path token-based authentication, they'll have to change all of their base paths for all of their clients, which gives you a compatibility problem with V1, mixing V1 and V2 on a technology stack. So I didn't describe that very well. If you have a CLI at V1, you have the base path that you can specify the API mediation layer.
Yeah.
That will give you token-based authentication. V2 clients, it's changed to be the you know, Zowe config.json, but it's fundamentally just the same information, just presented slightly differently, and much better. But if you're a customer and you went to if you're a customer and you had your plugins at V1 or V2, you would still need to know whether that API mediation layer was at V1 or V2, because at V2 they're going to be called Broadcom, which is what you're doing, BCM.
BCM,
yeah, B1 they were CA. That client would need to know. It wouldn't be able to just switch back and forth between the API boundary bridge between a V2 API mediation layer and a V1 mediation layer presenting to the Broadcom CLI plugins is different. And I'm just thinking that through in my mind, because we were thinking about whether there would be the possibility of a window of a V2 client being able to connect to V1 or V2 without any you know, interruption, required. And I don't think that's possible because that person configuring that client configuration in the team config file would have to be aware of that change, wouldn't they? It's just a thought.
Yeah, I'm just thinking it through. I mean,
which is unrelated to V1 to V2, because effectively you've changed the service IDs of those. Okay, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It just popped into my mind. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's more, I think, Joe, where you're going is a compatibility question.
Yeah, exactly, Rose. Yeah.
And
Okay.
yeah, and we've tried to articulate those compatibility scenarios at the VNext site to give folks a clear indication of what we expect to be compatible and what we expect to be incompatible. And this seems like it's going to be an incompatible situation.
Without intervention. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Rose.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just limited to the CLI client either. In fact, the CLI client is probably the easiest case to address this, but in any case, like if folks are accessing these APIs directly within an organization and then the base path change, all of that automation has to be updated as well. So it's just not specific to the CLI, but with the team config in the CLI, it's kind of easier to address this now, and that an admin could change this value in one place and then distribute it to all of their users.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Good point. I wonder, Elliot and the rest of the squad, there was talk of having the ability to leave behind some kind of proxy sort of forwarding address. So you could say, if this URL has changed, you can just pick up the old one and forward it. Did that get implemented? Is there still an issue for that? Is that perhaps something that might be worth revisiting just to give that path?
To resolve that compatibility issue?
Well, so you would basically say if anybody, so Mike brought up a very good point. So I know customers that have built, Node.js web front ends, using React and, some quite sophisticated in-house things where they're calling APIs. And if you change that API contract, which is doable, it occurs all the time, and there's a lot of benefits to doing that. You can have some sort of mapping file that just, so if rather than the mediation layer just saying a 404, if it gets an old one, it can say, oh, well, actually, I do know that this is just literally maps to a new one, and they can just flow that mapping through.
Yeah.
And some admin can configure the mediation layer to do that, and then just leave that mapping file around for as long as they want to.
Like basically this was there for a long time in the V1, and we want to get rid of this mechanism.
Okay.
And that's why it's a breaking change in V2. But it was in place, this mapping, this was there.
Okay.
But if that mapping is, Andre, if it's a potential solution to enabling that compatibility across versions, then it might be something we need to look at again. Okay, I'm making a note. That's good feedback.
Yeah, I don't want to put more work your way, and you don't have to do anything clever, but just perhaps having some way of insulating, so you can allow the admin, have some, say, look, I'm leaving the mapping in for 6 months or something, or
Well, base path is configurable by the organization, right? It's not necessarily static, right? It can be customized, or is that not the case anymore?
I think, well, certain parts of it can be, yeah.
Okay, because in a general case, if an organization wanted to change their customization, it'd be nice if there was some built-in way to list other proxies, like if they were going from one format to another, make that easy transition a little bit easier. I know a big problem with direct to service, for example, is folks will change the port that things are running on with no proxies, and then everybody's just broken. So if we could solve that, if folks are using the API mediation layer where maybe they changed the base path for some organizational specific reason. I don't know, probably not related to this specifically, like the breaking change aspect, but just in general, the idea of having a proxy from something old to something new would be good.
I'll just speak up on the technical aspect of the proxy. I think one of the reasons why we wanted to remove the old pattern is because the way we were doing that proxy, where both were supported, that was on the Java code level. So it pretty significantly increased our code complexity. And then also we would run into things like where we'd have bugs with configuration for the different path patterns, like CORS requests were configured differently because it was missed. Just based on how we implemented the CORS configuration, and that was because we implemented the proxy at the Java code level. But if there's a way to do this proxy outside of Java, as a a static mapping file or something, then maybe that's something we could look at. But I think at the Java code level, it does make sense to remove the old path pattern.
Yeah, I agree, Carsten. Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Definitely, you want to get the best out of the performance you can, and avoid the cores and the overhead. But there's perhaps something as basic as, before you throw a 404, just have some way of looking it up in a static file, let people know it's slower, write a warning. Yeah.
Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for the conversation, and don't hesitate to reach out. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will stop the recording.